Hello, everyone, and welcome. You're now live, so I'm going to get going. Format of this tonight is just a round of introductions for the people on the panel and me, and then I will be asking them questions as a moderator for about a half hour time, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and answers, and Anthony will help moderate that when we get there. Just to give a bit of context for all of this, first, we've been hosting these sessions as a way of looking at the space ahead and talking a little bit of our hopes and dreams for the future. I'm speaking to everybody from the unceded territories, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, also known as Vancouver. So I'll introduce myself a bit and then let Chance and Stephanie introduce themselves, and then I will give you a bit of context before we start the Q&A. So my name is Amita Kuttner. I am running to be the next leader of the Green Party of Canada, and today's topic is firearms policy. And I don't know that there's much context really that we need about me. I live in a very rural area on an island off the coast of BC, though I am in Vancouver at the moment. And I have a PhD in astrophysics. So Stephanie, why don't you go?
I am Stephanie. I use they, them pronouns. I'm on the traditional territory of the Siksika Davies, as well as Region 3 Métis, also known as Lethbridge, Alberta. I guess I've been a PAL holder since, I think it was around 2005 is when I got mine. And I originally started looking into it as a way for sustenance, as that is one of the more environmentally friendly ways of maintaining a nutrition plan that's local, and kind of have just been learning and developing information over the years in regards to all the different types of gun information. So that's a bit about me.
My name is Chance Davies. I'm one of the policy leads on this campaign. I've come from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta, the traditional homelands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda and the Tsuut'ina, along with Métis Nation Region 3. I'm a firearm owner myself. I've been one since 2018. And a lot of my firearm ownership comes down to target shooting, and it's just a barrel of fun for myself.
This is the point where I realized that Chance promised a bunch of jokes and I'm gonna have a hard time keeping it together.
Oh,
I was
yes.
gonna warn everybody that it's actually really warm where I am too, and now we have wildfire smoke, so my brain not on full capacity, so I'm likely to be finding this a lot more funny than usual. So before I go into some of the discussion topics, I would just like to talk a bit about the policy process that we use to come to the conclusions that are in our policy book and also what they mean. And I think first and foremost, Green Party policy is always approved by the members. So everything that we've put forward, some of it is very similar to what Green Party policy is, some of it differs a bit. Some of it's just stuff that isn't addressed in current Green Party policy. But for any of it to become official, it would of course have to go through membership approval. But we definitely stand by the process that we use to get to where it is. And this is not what I entirely expected, but I learned a lot in this, and I think that I hope that we share some of that with you tonight. Our policy process is basically talking about evidence for real. What does evidence-based policy actually look like? And as a scientist, this is something that matters a great deal to me because I'm very irritated all the time with politicians that cherry pick information or talk to one person and get some information and base policy off that. And fundamentally, when you're looking at applying the scientific method to policymaking, you actually want to have things like your assumptions and your intentions and what you're actually going about doing, instead of just trying to figure out what solutions to put forward without properly defining the problem. So in that, what we tried to do was talk about our values. What is it that we hold to be important? What is the world? What is the vision of the future that we actually are trying to achieve? What does that look like? And then let's look at a wide range of evidence, whether that's reading papers from a variety of sources, talking to experts, and in terms of experts, talking to people with lived experience from pretty much every side of any equation. And so that's the process we used overall. And we had a pretty big team working on it. And there were some fun arguments because I think during the process, and another reason I'm acting as facilitator is because that's what I was to the policy process as well. I did not try, this isn't just ideas out of my head for sure. This is about going through it and figuring it out. But the idea here for us was to find balance. We want policy that lasts a long time in our country. And what we think is necessary for that is having something that doesn't push people away, it doesn't alienate people, it gets to the heart of the issues, addresses the real problems, and is something we can try to communicate with everybody. And it's not always easy, and there are, you know, give and take in a lot of places, but surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, some stuff, you know, there is a clear balance point. And what mattered to us in terms of firearm policy development was safety and simplicity. And, you know, absolutely, we are grounded in a concept of personal liberty and individual freedom, as well as wanting to make sure everyone has their rights protected and has their needs met in our society. So that's what it all comes down to. But we have a bunch of complex stuff out there and we can talk about the details of that. But beforehand, I just want to go through and talk about some stuff with Stephnie and Chance to give us more context for this conversation. So let's actually frame the conversation. And I'll speak to this from my own bit a little, in that I don't think it was clear to me exactly what Canadian law was like in terms of firearm ownership. And a lot of what I think people assume, and what definitely people I have known have assumed, is that we have very similar laws to the US. And so we have a very similar setup and situation. And that's not entirely true. So if you could both give a little bit of context of what our laws currently are like, and, you know, whether you choose to address recent changes or not, I'll leave that up to you.
Well, I'm going to give you the bullet points, pun intended. Really, within this country, we are not similar to the United States. The firearm regulations that we have are very tightly regulated. They usually orient around basic training and then basic licensing, in which the RCMP review the individual in question who's looking for a firearms license, and they decide based on a background check based on whether or not they successfully completed their PAL or our PAL. And then we basically shuffle them into one of two different licenses. The first license is non-restricted. So those, generally speaking, apply to rifles and shotguns, long guns, as we would probably call it. The other one is a restricted license, which usually applies to handguns and a selection of different long guns based on however the RCMP chooses to define it on that very day. So once someone is shuffled into that, they need to get their non-restricted first. After that, then they can get the restricted. Can usually get a weekend to do both of them. It takes a long time to make sure that someone is allowed to. Once they do, they have to follow a bunch of different rules, though. They have to make sure that they have proper storage for their guns. They have to make sure that they're going to places that when they're buying and selling the guns, they follow the procedure outlined by the RCMP. And every day for firearm owners, daily criminal background checks, if you will, I know there's another name for it. They're conducted to make sure that that person is compliant with the Criminal Code of Canada and is not on the run, if you will. And they do this for a long time, and they've done it for a long time. And there's a bunch of other restrictions on magazine size and what type of storage is okay. And we're not going to get into all of that because we would be here for probably a weekend trying to decipher this very complex code. But those are the main points that anything to add though, Stephnie?
I think you covered most of it, just that, yeah, it can get really complex very quickly. And if I remember correctly, you can be as young as is it 16 or so to get your PAL, if I remember correctly. I can't remember the age exactly. But considering the younger age that we can get people registered so that they can get out hunting and using firearms, the complexity of the legislation isn't understandable to the level that we need to have it at. So that's where my biggest focus on the policy side of it is, making it accessible and understandable to everyone, and not so much on the actual points of the policy. Because as a PAL holder myself, I don't currently own any firearms due to circumstances, as well as they're just expensive. And as a student, I just didn't have the budget for it. But looking into it, it's also kind of turns a person off, because if you're really worried about meeting the legal requirements, it can get very scary. And that's the part that I don't like about it, because I think we should always be able to learn and access tools for our usage, and do so in a non-complex way. So
yeah, there are certainly huge barriers to entry to participating in a lot of the things within this country that firearm owners do, whether it's hunting, whether it's sports shooting, a whole host of different things. And when the code is so complex and the ability to get the licensing and training is so complex, it really disproportionately impacts people who, one, don't have time, two, don't have money, and three, they're just far away. So that, yeah, that'd probably be, those are the main things I think there.
Awesome, thank you. So next on my list of things that I want to make sure we talk about is the concept of safety. And from a gun user or gun ownership perspective, the restrictions and bans that came in this year, were they effective? What do you think, given the actual objective? So what was stated about what they were trying to achieve? Did they achieve that? What did that actually look like, depending on the types of firearms that somebody might have? And so what impact did it have on safety, you think, and what impact did it have on the lives of firearm owners?
Well, one of the challenges, and you talked about it a little earlier, that we have is that a lot of these bans that are brought in, a lot of these regulations, they're very arbitrary. They're not rooted in the actual functionality of the weapon. They very much don't have public safety experts and firearm owners in the same room when these are being developed. And I think that produces inefficiencies. And that's kind of that's the crux of this issue, is that no one is listening to the people who use these weapons. That's a big problem. That should make us nervous, because if we're not consulting with people who are stakeholders in this issue, what does that say about us as a democratic state? What does that say about us as a society who likes to root their policies in evidence? And what does that say about us just in general? And I think it says that we're not listening, and that's where we need to start. These bans, they all seem very random. I mean, there's a huge list of them. I was very lucky, knock on wood, that I wasn't impacted on them, but I know so many people who went from having 23 guns in their safe because they're a big firearm owner, they love their guns, to 2, 3. Like, that's how disproportionately impacts them. And certainly that's not the case for everyone. But the difference between one of the guns that were banned and one of the guns that were not, they are essentially the same gun. So why were those decisions made? I don't know. Nobody really knows. We just kind of took it at face value that the people making the decisions were making them with the best interests of public safety and firearm owners. But that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, and from my side of it, coming at it from a less experienced side in regards to the restricted and prohibited side of the firearms, when I originally looked at it, I kind of thought it might be good, but then as I started to talk to my friends who are more into the sports and restricted side of the gun ownership, it became clear that the nuances that a person like myself who doesn't have the experience to understand and stuff weren't being clearly explained. But then when you actually talk to the owners of these guns and they explain the differences and that there weren't really any differences and stuff, it's really hard to have trust in the policy or legislation that's been created when you try to go back to find out why the reasoning was that they put it through, because they haven't provided that. They haven't provided the background. They haven't provided the research as to why they did it. And so that's where we really need to start having more openness about the process of how different licensing and legislation comes into place and bans, because if we only have the kind of media clips to, as for lack of a better phrase, of this is dangerous, this is why we're banning it. Yeah, that seems good on the surface, but then as you start to dig into it, you realize that's not really doing anything, and it's not doing what you had hoped it would intend to do. And that's the side that gets lost in our conversation in regards to people who don't have that background or expertise, or are able to reach out to someone who does in their circle, because they might not even know anyone who owns any guns. So they're only taking it based off of what's in the media. And so we really need to be having more open conversations and explain what these differences are and what they mean. And that's what's really lacking, I find.
From the perspective of being outside, or mostly outside of that, I know people, of course, who suddenly had their inherited treasures be illegal for pretty much no reason. And that didn't make any sense to me. And that opened up learning about a lot of it, which I have now just find irritating for so many reasons. And one is because it seeks to cause division when there doesn't need to be any along arbitrary lines. It isn't an example of good policy or evidence-based policy by a long way. And it also erodes trust. And I think at the core of wherever we need to go in terms of firearms legislation has to be that trust, and bringing together different sides of the conversation, different perspectives, so people actually get on the same page of what's going on, what actually can help, so we start solving some problems together. So right about that, I want to talk a bit about bringing different sides together and bridging narratives, and the differences between what it's like to live in a rural area compared to an urban area, but that certainly is not the only divide. And so I want to also talk about different levels of things, and the concept of whether it would be possible, for instance, to have like a gun-free society. And to me, looking at our country, I don't think that that's feasible. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't say, well, let's talk about some examples. Why is it important? Why does it matter? Why can't we just ban handguns and AR-15s?
Well, I think when it comes down to why we shouldn't do something, I think we should first ask the question of why are we doing it in the first place? This debate has been so highly polarized within this country, and for sure down in the States as well, but in this country, and it really falls behind two main lines. You're either generally an urban person, and you're generally more of a progressive, for lack of a better term, in which case there's a lot of correlation between that, meaning that you're a supporter of gun control, or you're a rural, more conservative person, and you're not. Those are two different sides, and it doesn't have to exist on that left-right paradigm where we have one side of the country who is supportive of it and the other side that's not. Rural folks use it. I mean, I grew up in Grand Prairie, like the rural countryside of Grand Prairie. I was around guns throughout my whole life. Everyone I knew was in a household that had guns. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. Some people would take their kids out hunting. Some kids I know that their dad had a gun in there because of predator defense. Some people just liked doing some good old clay pigeon shooting. And, all of those are reasonable reasons to have a firearm, but they're not necessarily ones that a lot of urban folks can sympathize with. And I think it's really important that urban folks put themselves in the shoes of people who are in the countryside, who are living on that family farm, who are out in Fort McMurray, who are out in Yellowknife. those people are just as Canadian as the rest of us, and they deserve to be included in this conversation. They deserve to have the same rights and dignity that we respect for everybody. And when we're denying someone the opportunity to live how they live peacefully and freely, we're taking away something within all of us. And I think that it would be a loss. And I think that that's a loss in and of itself. So I think we should try to empathize with both sides of the discussion. And I also don't think it's unreasonable for people to want some controls on firearms. And our platform has outlined what we think. So we agree that there should be some controls, but as they stand right now, it is too stringent and it is too one-sided, and that is too unfair, to put it blankly. So we need to move past that. We need to bring the left of this country and the right of this country together to put some stable, secure firearms legislation together that respects the liberty of firearm owners themselves. And I don't think that's too much to ask. And I don't think most Canadians would find that unreasonable. I think most Canadians will see the logic in that.
I'm going to pop in here for a second and offer the other perspective for a second. And that I would also say that people who live in the countryside and who are or have been around firearms their whole lives should think about too, you know, where that urban perspective is coming from, of when the only thing that you've ever known to involve a handgun, for instance, is crime and violence and harm to your community. And we'll get to that in a bit, and the actual things that we can do to work on that, especially because that's not, you know, it doesn't come under the same category as legal ownership. But what I have learned through this is that, you know, there are common uses for handguns in the countryside for, you know, predator defense or even hunting. And also, you know, the arbitrariness of the definition of an AR-15 compared to anything else, and, you know, use for sports. So, you know, getting down to what the heart is there. Is this something that is a symbol, a legitimate symbol of something that is often seen as dangerous and harmful? Or is it actually being used for that? And in the cases that is actually being used for that, let's figure out how to stop that. But that what we associate with it has a lot to do with our perspectives. And that is what tends to be the difference. And I love that you brought that up. Sorry, so Stephanie.
Yeah, well, I kind of feed into that. So I grew up in Red Deer originally, and then I pretty much lived in Lethbridge for about the same amount of time. Both are your smaller urban centers, where you have that mixture of rural and urban fringe, is I guess what we call it in human geography. And so you see both sides of it. You see the rural usages and stuff, and people being more comfortable around guns and gun ownership. And that's because it's something that they've had a chance to be exposed to. They've had the education around it. When you've had a chance to be exposed and educated around something, you're less likely to be afraid of it. And so that's something that I think we should keep in mind as well. Whereas in the urban centers, it's less frequent for people to have that like knowledge or that contact with people who've had guns in a legal sense. It is much more likely that it's more in an illegal sense. And so you don't have the education, you don't have the safety stuff in place there. So, and then there's a lot more fear. And one of the things that I was lucky enough to do in my education growing up was I actually got to take hunter's education in junior high. There's not a lot of people who can say that they've had that experience or that those options are still available. And a lot of that has to do with insurance and liability now in regards to schools. But it's the same with driving, that the people who are more exposed to driving and stuff and have gone through the education courses and all that fear it less than the people who don't have access to those. So a huge component, I think, around firearms and firearm safety is making education programs more public, more available, just in a general sense, so that we can have more safety around that type of stuff and more security. And with a better understanding, we can get better informed opinions and feedback as well. So that's just kind of been my experience, because I've known legal and illegal owners, and it's two very different worlds, and that's the scary thing. So.
Thank you. I think the last thing I would add to this about balancing narratives is one that I find particularly interesting, given that we talk about animal rights in our platform and the importance of protection of nature. And, you know, we found a position of balance there too, we think. And I appreciate that. And it's been interesting to come to the merge point, basically, of perspectives that maybe previously I thought you could never bring together. And yet I think you can. Okay, so one of the things that has bugged me for a while in Canada, in the conversation about firearms legislation, is the vilification of firearm owners. Because it's basically saying, you know, this is criminal, you're causing problems with safety. And yet legal firearm owners, responsible firearm owners are not the ones doing that. And what I think is lost there is you are the exact people that need to be part of the conversation of safety regulations. If we are going to actually also get on the same page about solving gun crime, should we not all be on the same page and having that conversation? And when it starts in a point of division, how can you ever get there? So given that, let's talk about safety and crime. How do we deal with gun crime? Where is it coming from? Where are the guns coming from? What does it look like? What's the difference between, say, legal gun ownership and illegal gun ownership in terms of crime?
Stephanie, do you want to go?
Yeah, that's such a complex topic, and it's...
Sorry, start wherever you want.
I guess the most recent thing that comes to mind for myself is that in Lethbridge, the police actually just arrested someone for 3D printing guns. So it's unclear from that if it was actual guns for bullets or if it was for airsoft from the report, but by the sounds of it, it was for bullet stuff. Which adds in a whole new dimension. Does that mean we go and we start banning 3D printers, right? Like, you don't want to do that. That's not solving the issue and stuff. So when it comes to legal and illegal entities, it's very, very complex because there's never just one thing that something is used for. And that's the same even with firearms, even though we have a narrative that the firearms are only for sport or for hunting. They also do a lot of other things for people. They bring people together over commonalities. They increase skill sets that can be used for other areas like tracking. Tracking is a huge one. I first got my tracking that I use in search and rescue now from hunting lessons and stuff like that. There's like all these different things, and that's all on the legal side, right? But then you have the illegal side of it, and you have that coming from multiple different sources. You have it coming from international sources, have it from local sources. You have homemade, you have gangs and organized crime. There's so many various different levels in that regard. And we obviously don't have a solution for it because we haven't even come close to dealing with the problem. And that was one of the things that I kind of learned growing up in Red Deer, because we're kind of a hub of gang issues and stuff. So it's not uncommon for there to have been a lot of illegal firearms, especially in regards to the drug trade. So then that brings into that question of, where are the guns illegally being used? What are they being used for? And from what I've seen and from what I've heard, a lot of it has to do with organized crime. And the organized crime is usually around child trafficking, people trafficking, drugs, and people not having their basic needs met, so they've turned to illegal methods to try and provide for those basic needs. So we need to be looking at the actual issues instead of these Band-Aid fixes, and that means looking at how we get the needs of everyone met so they aren't turning to the illegal parts. How are we dealing with the drug issues so that we're removing that organized crime component of it? And then how are we dealing with our borders as a whole nother game as well? So those are just some of my abstract thoughts on it.
No, and I think you really touched upon something there. The vast majority of gun crime within this country are not due to legal gun owners. Just put blankly, legal gun owners are not part of this issue. Or if they are, it's an extremely small amount. The main issue that we have when it comes to guns is from the illegal market. And we have that for a lot of different reasons. It's a very complex issue, but ultimately it comes down to one thing. People need to have their material needs met. At the end of the day, people need to have a safe place to sleep. People need to have a stable education so that they know they can constantly get education. People need job opportunities. People need poverty alleviation. People commit crime not because they're an inherently bad person. People commit crime because they're pushed into that situation due to necessity. That's the vast thing. And if we can work together, and that's a big ask, like, could we solve crime? That would be wonderful. But it's a bigger thing than that, because we have to hit all of these bigger objectives, and that's a complex thing to do. That's not an easy ask for anyone, but it starts with us by taking care of our fellow people in this country. Because when we take care of people, when people know that they have a life to look forward to where their needs are met, they're not going to be turning to crime. People don't grow up and when they're 7 years old, they think, oh, I'd like to be a criminal today. People think, I'd like to become a doctor. I'd like to become a nurse. I'd like to become a teacher, a janitor, whatever. And those people, through the fault of largely the government, but the society in general, do not get their needs met, and they're pushed to make bad decisions. Doesn't mean they're bad people. They're probably very good people, but we need to be cognizant of that, and that's where we need to put our energy in, is solving these long-term issues, not the band-aid solutions that people talk about, right? We need a long-term solution to this. And the long-term solution is getting rid of poverty. It's making sure we have mental health supports, a whole host of things. You could look through the whole Green Party platform or our platform, and you'd probably find a lot of good ways of solving this. But one of them is not making it stricter to own guns. That's not part of this solution.
Thanks, Chance. And I think that, you know, the issue with organized crime and trafficking is kind of on top of that, because in that, you know, people are drawn into it through necessity, but there is a core there that is going to exist otherwise that we need to figure out a way to deal with. But I think that both of those things, all the things that you touched on, are very, very important, and getting to the sources of kind of inequity in general, but also the sources of violence in our society, is something that goes beyond the options that people have for perpetuating physical violence. And, you know, addressing other things like domestic abuse is also really important. But I have this frustration with this, in the fact that we, you know, legal guns are not contributing to gun crime that much. So when we go down the road of putting extra restrictions on that, it seems like it's actually a distraction from working together on the real issues.
Yeah.
And figuring out how we deal with illegal guns in our country, and having good definitions for people so that you don't have gun owners that are intending to be legal gun owners suddenly become illegal gun owners, which is not really the intention either, because I don't think, you know, that doesn't really help. So in that, can we talk a little bit about classification and what it is exactly that we came to the conclusion about, and why?
So the classification system that we currently have is, like I said, to repeat, I don't know if we had anyone new that joined, but there's non-restricted, which is long guns essentially, and restricted, which is some long guns, and also in addition to handguns. And what we really wanted to make it sure that we put forward is, because we know that legal gun owners are not the problem in this country, because we know that they're very compliant, they follow the rules, they're not contributing to this violence that we're seeing, this criminal violence that we're seeing, we want to make sure that for firearm owners, that while balancing the need for public safety through licensing and through training, it is simplified. So we want to make sure that the non-restricted and the restricted firearms are merged into one classification system. Now, we get a lot of questions, and I can see the wheels turning in a lot of firearms owners thinking that, well, this is a way for us to move non-restricted firearms to the same regulations as restricted firearms. In fact, clamp down on them harder than usual. No, it is the reverse. We want to make it easier for legal firearm owners to have permissible guns within this country. There are certainly going to be some guns that we're just not going to allow, but that needs to be decided by firearm owners and public safety experts. It's not something arbitrarily mandated by government. So we have the permissible guns and the prohibited guns, but we want to make it easier for people to get access to these firearms if they are licensed and trained to do so. Now, the specifics on magazine sizes, the specifics on bumper stocks, all these types of things, we don't have things regarding that right now. And the reason that we don't is because, like I've said, we want to listen to firearm owners and we want to listen to public security experts and what they have to say, because I am not someone who understands magazine sizes. I'd be fine with the restrictions the way that they are for me personally, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the same for everyone. And I know lots of people who tell me magazine sizes are weird, arbitrary, they don't make sense. Let's get down and work on making sure that they make sense, because if they don't make sense, what's the point of it, right? But yeah, simplifying a merged classification system. That's what we want. What do you think, Stephanie?
Yeah, and I think it gives more opportunity to provide better training in regards to handling, storage, safety, as well as mental health. Like, I know that was a big component, and it's talked about in another part of our platform, not necessarily in the firearms section, but that we're working on the mental health of anyone who is owning a firearm. I have friends who've lived through experiences, unfortunately, where someone had a mental break and had a firearm, and they came over and shot up their house. That has had major traumatic implications on that family and stuff. Whereas if we had better healthcare standards in place, especially for people who own the legal firearms and stuff, that they can access and get help when life is rough and stuff like that, then we're less likely to see those occurrences happen. So we need to make sure that that's a part of the discussion when we're looking at the reclassification system. Like, I would be personally in support of every time I have to go and renew, that I have to go through an online course again and score an X amount percentage, just so that I'm up to date on any new safety measures that have come up in the last 5 years. That maybe I have to do a psych evaluation or something like that. That's the type of stuff that we would look at. We need to have a conversation with experts and stuff when doing the policy making. And that should be something that's open to the conversation, because personally, I want access to firearms. But I also want to make sure that I'm protecting myself as well as others in my community. So, and if that's the way that I can do that, then that's something I want to be open to and I want to push for. And I think those are the types of conversations we also have to have when we're looking at reclassifying the gun registry, gun licensing and registry stuff.
Yeah, I think the training is very important, and especially access to training. So you say you need to have this level of training, but you also need to make it available so that people can go through the process. Yeah. And yes, affordable is part of accessible to me, but yes, yeah, absolutely necessary. And then I think also with mental health, there needs to be more detail and destigmatization because there are mental health situations which you're not going to put you in a situation that's going to be dangerous. And to say like, oh, well, there's just so much negativity around the way we discuss that. And so we need to talk about what those experiences are and how we help each other through it in a way that is not going to cause more problems for anyone.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think another thing on that is to me, you know, the Green Party has a value of nonviolence. And to me, that means something very particular, which is a concept not of violence itself and what a violent act is, what a violent intention is, and also systemic violence and oppression is also violence to me. And so separating something, especially that is used as recreation, when usually it's, you know, or it can be seen as something that is violent in itself, might not particularly be true. And if this is somebody's method of survival through hunting, it is not the same thing as, you know, a lot of the other ways that especially firearms are depicted in media, which is kind of what is fed to a lot of people. And I think that nonviolence and, you know, support of people is so important. And we tend to look around as to what we could be or how we would do things differently. And the fact that we have the US as neighbors is a bit problematic because we have issues of porosity for our border, for sure. But you can look at countries in Northern Europe that have as many guns as we do per person and who have less violence than we do. And, you know, even less suicides. So it's going to be interesting to, you know, have that conversation and talk about, you know, reducing violence in our society overall. So I want to end on one last thought that I think is really important for me, and then we'll let you guys also talk about anything else you want to add before moving to questions. But after all of this process and the many discussions, what I've kind of ended up with is the idea that we want gun and firearm legislation that people want to adhere to, because it's important for people to want to. Because I think if you have stuff that is too complicated, too arbitrary, too random, it will encourage people to not participate in the system. And if you're not participating in the system, you're actually creating more of an illegal gun problem. So it is in our best interest to find firearms legislation that we can get the entire country on board for. And I don't think that here we're suggesting we have the ultimate answers to this, that we're going to be right in everything, that we won't be checking with a lot more stakeholders in this. And also, I would want to add that, again, for Green Party policy, it has to go through the membership. So we stand by what we came up with for the reasons we did. We're absolutely open to shifting it here and there, clarifying our wording. You know, the document we put forward actually had a lot of work done on it to make it more accessible and readable, which means that we did lose some of the jargon and specifics here and there. But, you know, it is a living document and it is not official policy at the moment. And that goes for pretty much almost everything in there. So these are conversations that the point of it for us was to create and develop the policy process itself, and then help us get to a place within the party where we can have a conversation about this at a larger scale with more people and do a really thorough check of evidence so that we get the best answers possible and make sure our policy is achieving what we want for our society in terms of values, in terms of safety, and in terms of, you know, inclusion, and also then evidence. So Chance and Stephanie, do you have any last thoughts before we move on to questions and answers?
I'll say one more thing. Just one more. Last election, 2019, seems like a lifetime ago at this point with this whole pandemic going on, right? It just seems crazy to me how long it seems ago. But the Green Party of Canada released a platform, and it was not a hit. The platform that we released, at least the firearms section of it, was not a hit in rural communities. It did not click in rural communities, and rightfully so. The Green Party of Canada, one of the chief tenets that it has is participatory democracy. And I didn't really believe, and I still don't, that what they produced, the platform that they put out, really wasn't consistent with making sure that rural Canadians were democratically represented within decision-making about firearms. It was very much grounded in responding to what rural or what urban folks wanted. And I think that part of the Green Party of Canada, one of the reasons that I love this party so much, is that we do have an extensive policy list out there. But part of having an extensive policy means that we have the responsibility to make sure that when we're developing this policy, we're listening to lived experiences. And when we're putting in, when last election, 2019, we're putting in policy points on banning semi-automatics and banning handguns and making it more difficult for people to get these firearms, are we really holding ourselves to the tradition that the Great Party was founded on? Are we really consistent with who we are? And I think that when we start listening to rural Greens or rural progressives who've been left out of this conversation, we're going to be in a world of like, oh, I didn't realize about this, but they've been saying it for years. And so this is just part of that process of bringing this country together. So the gap between rural Canada and urban Canada is closed. So we can start talking with people on the other side of the country, because right now, that's not part of the process. And I think we can make it part of the process. So that would be my last kind of point that I'd want to make, just that emphasis on rural communities. Yeah. Stephanie, do you have anything else to add?
Not really. I think, like I said earlier, this is not a simple topic at all. And it involves so many other aspects. And it's just trying to keep that open mind to information and making sure that we're sourcing our information from the correct sources, and making sure all the voices are heard. And I know that at the end of the day, we're not going to please 100% of people, because we're always going to have those people who want either a complete ban or complete freedom to have whatever. And unfortunately, that's not something that as a society we can fully do. But I think our goal and what we've done with the platform policy that we've done is create that conversation and make sure that we're bringing all the voices to the table so that we can get the correct information and make something accessible and easily understood, that we could eventually move forward to a legislative process and hopefully help make a better firearms policy in Canada.
Yeah, thank you. I'm proud of what the team accomplished, and I think that, you know, it wasn't easy conversations, and it was, what was most important about it is that we actually did bring different perspectives and continue to have that conversation. And in many ways, it's not over. And the only last thing that I would probably add to this is that the Green Party, you know, the notion of participatory democracy, but also about democracy, we are representative, meaning that, you know, policy is member driven. And also our first job is to represent the people that we are elected to represent. And that therefore opinions on policies such as firearms may differ from region to region. And it would be primarily the responsibility of any Green MP to represent the people in their own riding. Mm-hmm. And in an issue, I think, like this, it's very important for that ability to be had. You know, there are things where, you know, it can come here and there, and really it comes down to a difference of values in the end. But this is something that also comes to emotion. And I would say that therefore, beyond the responsibility to represent your constituents is the responsibility of having conversations with other people that disagree, so that we can work on getting onto the same page somehow. So with that, now we will get to questions in the chat. So anybody who's been leaving questions.
I see the chat just piling up. Like every once in a while, something shows up there, and then it disappears in 1 second. I can't see it. So I'm excited to see what people are doing.
Yes. Yeah, and sorry if we haven't gotten to your questions yet. We haven't been answering any questions from the chat. Now is when we're going to be doing that. So let's go to the beginning. Anthony, would you like to moderate this section, or should I?
Sure, I can moderate. Just a quick note that I'm expecting my apartment buzzer to go off any minute now. So apologies in advance for that.
That's okay, Anthony.
So there's a question from Maria Rodriguez. I was looking for the stakeholder consultation that I assumed would or should have taken place and found this. There's a link in the chat to it. What do you think the problems and failings were with that process?
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to actually open up that.
I can go first if you'd like, Champ.
Yes, or summarize it for
this is my wheelhouse here. Statistical analysis and surveys. Yeah, so there is quite a few things wrong with just a preliminary glance at this. I haven't looked at it in any depth or detail, but automatically it's already, most of the respondents are urban versus rural. So if they're being weighted equally, that's an issue, and I can't really tell if they are or not based off the information that I can preliminary glance on. So when we're looking at something as complex as this, where you're going to have a marginalized group who has more lived experience, more knowledge, more information in this section, but it's something that the entire society is having a say in. There needs to be a different weighting put into the analysis to be able to compensate for that, because it can't be equally looked at. And I'm not sure how or what they did for weighting in that regard, and that would be where one of my questions came with that one. The other part is that the in-person meetings, which is usually where you'll get the most well thought out feedback from participants, because they have people there to lead people through thought questions. There's a chance for people to ask another person for clarification on the questions being asked. We're only held in large urban centers. That's also a bit of an issue. We also see that I wasn't able to see what type or how the questions were worded, but usually when they have the online questions, a lot of them unfortunately are biasly written. There's been very few government questionnaires that I have done where there hasn't been a bias in the way the questions were worded to try and get an answer one way or another if they have a targeted zone that they're trying to go through. So that would be one of my other concerns with this, is that I can't, and maybe it is somewhere else on the page, I just haven't come across it, but how the questions were asked would be one of my other major concerns with how this information was attained. That also said is there was written submissions that were allowed as well, and I think they did okay with probably that part, but once again, because they use all these different styles of trying to collect information, it's hard to tell without looking at their detailed analysis of what their methodology was to see where the biases might have occurred within it. And also what information was provided to people before they answered these questions. Because if you have someone who has a lot of background and information answering these questions, they're going to answer them completely different than someone who just came across the online survey and was like, hey, I have 50 minutes, I'll just fill this out. So with the surveys that I tend to look towards and find that give us comprehensible feedback is ones that provide information around the question being answered. And I have a feeling that that did not occur in this case. And I think that's why we're kind of seeing, like from what I'm reading, there's not a lot of really good information, in-depth information in this survey. And in this consultation process, from what I've seen, it's very generalistic. And that's where my biggest concerns would be with it. I don't know, I probably just created more questions and answers with that, but right now that's kind of where I stand with what I've been able to skim through. So
I can't add too much to that particular question myself, because I'm not someone who deals with, I don't have the thing in front of me, and I'm not a statistician. And I would need to take a more in-depth look at this and the methodology, as Stephanie was alluding to. But I can say that there is a problem if they're overrepresenting one demographic group over another, and that means that we're not accounting for the people who actually use firearms in a very day-to-day type sense, because urban users are generally more sport shooter oriented. It's just how it is. And we need to make sure that we get the full picture. And that's just part of making sure consultation is democratized. And that's easier said than done. I understand that, but someone's got to start the conversation, and goodness knows we do. So that's why when we were consulting with the people that we were consulting with, we did generally have a lot more rural folks, because rural folks are largely more firearm owners. Also, we're from Alberta too, so we have a lot of Albertan friends. So that's all I'll say there.
I'll just add to that a little bit about policy development and issues of technical details, is that when you are trying to specify something in great detail, it sometimes does not make sense to just be asking about that, but you want to gather as much information and opinions on it as you can from people. That's always really important. The democratization is key, of course, but also when you're looking at technical specifications, it doesn't always make sense. And so a lot of it for us in policy development, what we always try to get down to is the intention. So what is the policy actually supposed to achieve? What are you trying to do here? Why are you wanting to limit things more? What are the limitations supposed to accomplish? And so hearing from people about what they'd like to get will actually help you develop policy that will achieve what people are looking for. And so I think that was also, from my understanding of how it came out, it was missing some piece of intention of what the actual goal was. And so what we're told it accomplishes is not actually what it accomplishes. And so that to me means it isn't evidence-based. And so if you can do even a good job of checking with people or doing research or even checking with evidence, but if you're not having a evidence-based framework, you're still going to have a problem. So the next question is from Alex, and it is, I don't understand why we want to make it easier to get restricted guns. Is that what gun owners would like? Or is that what gun owners want? And also, how do you plan on making gun courses more affordable with tax dollars? I think this would be a good opportunity to talk about what the details are, the differences in restricted and non-restricted classes, and what it means in each class, and what it actually takes to get anything in the first place.
Well, like I was alluding to at the beginning, I mean, we have the non-restricted and restricted, and you have to get the non-restricted first as far as licensing process, and then the restricted afterwards. We talked with a bunch of firearm owners, a whole bunch of them. A lot of them were very surprised that this was the solution we came up with, and they were surprised not necessarily because the solution was bad. They loved the solution. It was just coming from a different position than they're normally used to seeing these types of things come from. So when we talked about classification, the goal was to make sure that it was simplified for firearm owners, for legal firearm owners. So when we were consulting with people, we made sure that the intention that was clearly outlined to them was that was the goal, was to simplify that. So we wanted to make sure that when someone went to get training and licensing, they would be able to get a shotgun or a handgun, and they would have the ability to utilize both of them safely, securely, and that was really what it came down to. We just wanted to make it easier because people who aren't causing the problem should not be held to the same level of regulation as people who are not causing the problem, if that makes sense. I'm saying it poorly, but I think the point is clear. Yes, maybe?
I would add to that. So there is a certain amount of simplification, and if something is not causing a problem, then why are we regulating something? But also, I think that there is actually a benefit. So if you're with the idea that when you have regulations that are too difficult for people to actually comply with, if they feel like it, will have a tendency to then go around the law. So if what you're doing is making it, sure, easier to get certain guns, but at the same time, making it so you have accessible training, you're actually probably helping people get the training they need. Whereas if they were choosing to say, well, I'm not going to bother with the restricted class, this is too complicated, and just go around it, you're actually ending up with more of a safety problem than if you are making sure that people have access to training. You can tell me if I'm right about that, policy people.
Oh, so I'm seeing all these things showing up in the comments responding to, I think, us or someone else. So I'm just trying to
we'll get to that in a second. We'll go down from where we are through the stuff. So.
Okay.
Stephanie, did you want to add anything to this one?
I'm sorry, I totally lost track.
Let me go back up to it. So we're discussing, why is it that we would reduce restrictions and make it easier to get
Right.
what is currently restricted class, and then also how are we looking at making gun courses more affordable?
Yeah. So I think coming at it from an accessibility point of view, which is kind of the point of view I try to bring to this policy part of the section that I helped work with, is that, simplifying it, making it easier, more user-friendly. That doesn't mean that it's less strict or anything like that necessarily. It could, but that's not necessarily what that means. It just means that people are more able to wrap their mind around what needs to be done, what they have to do to be safe, and how to handle these tools. And for whether it's for sports or if it's for like hunting, stuff like that. So one of the things I always found really interesting too with this, because I had to decide whether I was going for a PAL or an RPAL when I initially was going through, because my background's environmental science, having a PAL of either or is helpful because of research in the field. We usually have to take a shotgun or a rifle out for protection. So it was interesting because I just went for my PAL because that covered what I would need it for. But I was curious about the restricted side of things, but it was also more money, and so I chose not to do it. So if we remove those barriers so that people can have an education around these different things that are within our society, we're going to have better compliance as well with the different regulations and safety protocols. And that's kind of my goal with that, because I find it really interesting that my sibling, who's in theater and arts, has a restricted and I have a non-restricted PAL, and I'm more likely to actually go use a gun than my sibling is. They had to get it because in theater, they handle these different ones for different, I guess, plays or for filming and stuff, which I didn't know that was a thing, but I guess that's a thing. So when we're looking at it, that there's all these different fields that require this, and you have so many different people coming at it from different sets of minds, we need a simplified structure so that it's easier for people to understand and apply it to their situations as well.
Well, I've been sorting through to try to find where the next question is in the chat. I think I've found it, and I believe that it's from Ross. There's a lot of commentary, which everyone feel free to read in here. For the policy team, how do you see making changes like essentially removal of the restricted class relatable to the public at large and more immediately within the Green Party? Very much support the idea of eliminating usage restrictions at handguns for my own uses, but we can't ignore the people in places like Toronto that are absolutely terrified of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a messaging type of question. And I think that's an extremely fair messaging question. I mean, you can love the policy all you want, just like with any political issue, right? But if it's not being communicated to the people who are concerned about it and anxious about it and are pinning their hopes and fears on that discussion, that's going to create problems, obviously. The reason we decided to take one, balance, was because we wanted to make sure that it was coming with the best of intentions of balancing both the public security concerns of people within urban areas who are largely concerned about organized crime and the handguns or whatever being used in those particular issues with the firearm owners themselves. One of the challenges within this country, within many countries within the West, is this polarization of political issues by and large, not just with firearms in general, but with pretty much everything. That's not going to be something that we're necessarily going to be able to address because that's a huge issue. But what we can do is we can try to get rural folks and urban folks in the same room. Not an actual room, but, you know, in the same space so that they can discuss these things. A lot of times firearm owners, they might find themselves in maybe the CCFR groups. They might find themselves in rural communities where they're around a whole bunch of people who understand them, just like a lot of urban folks. We had, I think, 2 folks from Toronto, and when they first heard about this issue that we were talking about and how we were discussing it, they were very concerned. They were very concerned because, one, they didn't have the understanding that firearm owners had, and it wasn't clearly communicated to them. So they didn't really know what the regulations are. For instance, they didn't know that firearm owners get, or even just people who have the licenses, get regular background checks done on them. And so they were concerned about, well, what if someone who had the license was a criminal? Could that happen? And so once you start communicating with the other side of this issue, you can bring together them and try to find some balanced solution. And I think we're not going to find something that everyone likes. We might get really close, but if we work together, we can find something that works for the largest amount of people possible. That's reasonable for everyone included. That would be my best way of answering that question. It's a tough one, and it's something that we have been trying to work through as well.
Yeah, I don't really have much else to add to that than, yeah, fear is a huge thing and we can't just dismiss it. We have to understand where it's coming from, and we have to be able to provide support and information to try and deal with those fears. So this isn't something that would happen overnight. We have to have reasonable timeframes expected for this type of thing. And then if there has been a shooting or something that has occurred recently, we have to expect too that there's going to be a lot more scared people, and we're going to have knee-jerk reactions, and we have to make sure that we're managing those in a proper way, because those fears and those experiences are extremely legitimate, and we can't ignore that just because we might not have those same experiences. So that's something that would need to be having a discussion around, and it needs to be a continuous discussion in regards to anything, not just firearms, but anything that is majorly controversial and affects people's lives directly.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the heart of a lot of it. In any place that we have division, we need to have the conversations, and we need to have the forum for those conversations, for people to actually talk about different sides of things and to have people's fears addressed. I think a lot of things that either need to change or haven't changed are because of a lot of people living in fear because of something or another. And that's true when it comes to issues of inequality as well. Mm-hmm. You know, we are all living in a place of having everything we have and our families taken away from us, when we should not be living in that reality. But while we have that, anything plays on our fears. We have to absolutely respect that. I think the other piece of this is to have a real plan to reduce gun violence in cities, have a plan to tackle illegal gun ownership and gun crime in general. And this has to be presented along with it, because it goes hand in hand. You know, there's a reason that people have fears around these things. And because there are issues. If the issues are really not coming, as they aren't, from legal firearm owners, then, you know, we need to separate that conversation. But it can't be without the other side of it, which is addressing the actual problem of gun crime.
So I don't see another question in the chat right now, but Charles' latest comment is interesting. I'd actually like to explore that a little bit. Compromising on policy that leaves innocent Canadians open to persecution and injustice will eventually lead to civil resistance up to and including civil disobedience. We are there now. It relates to firearms policy, but I think we see analogies to other areas of policy as well. So discuss.
I will start off by saying that I think there's a really big difference between compromise and balance. And there is a difference between giving and taking different things that you want versus what you need, compared to finding policy that is actually going to help the most people possible, make people's lives as easy as possible across the board. And on that, there are things you never would compromise on. You just never would. Balance is not about giving and taking. It is about finding what can work. And I think that at the end and at the beginning, you actually need to be working with whoever you're working with that understanding, that it isn't there as some like, well, I'll get this, you get that type of conversation. It's about agreeing on what we actually want for society together, and then figuring out how to find the balance between everyone's needs. But it's not about taking things from people or having that sort of mentality. And that is a departure, I think, from the way that politics has been done, because it has been about you present what you want and the other person presents what they want, and they're just super different. And then you scramble them together until everybody gets not what they wanted. And what's left out is the fact that usually in a lot of legislation that we see come through doesn't address the real needs of people in general. So part of any process of balance to me is always being on the same page of the intention that you have with the people you're working with.
Well, and I'd just like to add to that I think, like, in regards to how we develop this policy as well as the rest of the policy, many of us came from different points of view and different experiences and different knowledge areas. And we didn't agree on a lot of different things. But we use that principle of finding the balance, not the principle of the give and take that is normally found. And I think that's what has created such an interesting livable document. And the fact that we had discussed that at the beginning, that this too needed to be a living document, that it couldn't just be, we've set this in stone kind of thing, and this is what we're standing on the hill for. It's that as new information and new viewpoints emerge, we can adjust accordingly and find new ways of solving the problems and actually figuring out what is the actual core issue. Whereas so many of these things, when we're looking at it from just the initial problem and stuff, we're seeing the surface, not the actual core issue at the base of it. So to be able to discover what that core base is, we have to have all these different views and understanding, and this space to be able to have those conversations, the difficult ones, and be able to respect the fact that we're all coming from these different angles. And by doing that, we've been able to unearth where some of these core issues are and actually come up with a policy to deal with what we've identified as these issues, instead of trying to solve a whole bunch of little problems that are offshoots of the bigger problem.
I guess what I would say to this is, we're always, within our society, we are always going to have people, good people, bad people, who are not going to be compliant 100% with the laws that are implemented. We're never going to get 100% compliance with all the laws. That is something that we recognize. The goal that we are trying to put forward, and I'll stress this point again, is once again balance. We want to make sure that firearm owners and public people who are concerned more about public safety come to the center on this. And that is not going to be a happy thing for 100% of all people. We understand that. There are going to be some people who will always work and will always try to make sure that handguns are all, that we have a gun-free society. There's just going to be people out there like that. And we're also going to have a lot of people who don't want any rules at all. What we want to do is we want to bring those two sides of the country together so that we can develop a reasonable policy so that reasonable people can live peacefully, despite the fact that maybe their interests aren't always aligned. And that's a challenge in and of itself, but it's something that for all of the parts of our policy that we've developed, we've tried to do the whole way through. We're doing it the best we can, but we're not going to get 100%. And I think it's okay to accept the fact that this is a living document and it's not 100% perfect. And the gaps that we have within it can be resolved with more conversation. And that's what we need, is more conversation.
I just want to add, because it just got added in the chat here, that balance is another way of saying that firearm owners will continue to be demonized. And I say that's exactly the opposite. You can't find balance if you demonize anybody on any side of any equation. And that's also the difference, I think, between the notion to me of balance and compromise, is that you may be compromising if you continue to always think of somebody with a differing opinion as permanently that way and permanently an enemy in some capacity. Whereas it's not about this. This is about addressing the fears that people actually have and meeting them there on that, and also saying, no, legal firearm owners in Canada are not causing violence. And implying that is causing division in a way that is unacceptable as well. So all of that together. And there's another comment up there that I wanted to talk about a bit, but I also wanted to add that, you know, we, in these policies, we're saying that provincial jurisdiction is its own separate thing. But so the conversation that I wanted to touch on is the idea of what guns are necessary in urban areas. Like, why is it a thing to be reasonable to need them there? And this is definitely, Chance can agree to this. Like, I think Chance was surprised at the beginning of this process where I was anyway. And that comes from the fact that I, know a lot of firearm owners in the first place. But I was like, well, yeah, but why? Why do you need to have, allow guns in a city? Why couldn't you just change that? And so I think it's in the kind of like different things as well. And there's the conversation about what a weapon is actually like versus what it looks like and what it's capable of and all that. But if you could talk a little bit about the specifics about why, what would it actually do if we looked at just urban restriction?
When you're saying urban restriction, are you talking about the lived experiences of urban folks as they relate to firearms currently, or as it could?
Either way. So I'm saying, having an urban handgun ban, what would that do to legal firearm owners? Why would there be a legal handgun owner in a city? And et cetera, that sort of thing.
Well, like I've talked about earlier, one of the main reasons that urban folks become firearm owners, myself included, is for sports shooting. That is the chief thing. A lot of people, they have a good time. They head out there to Kananaskis, myself included, and they have a good cold Sunday doing some target shooting. And for a lot of folks in urban areas, that might be one of the main reasons that they do it. In fact, don't quote me on it, but I do believe there's something on that. I think I'll have to check the government website on that. But that is the main issue. So we want to make sure that we're not putting in an urban handgun ban, because we don't want to take away that opportunity. Because if they store it properly, to get the license, to get the training, we want to make sure that they can live a life within urban Canada and still be able to go to, whether it's in the city or outside of the city, in my case it's outside of the city, and still be able to use a gun. I do believe that would be answering your question. I think it's just to make sure that this country isn't divided, because having different jurisdictions where the rules are completely different, it makes it difficult for this country to come together. I guess that would be the main thing I'd be wanting to say. Stephanie, got a comment or anything there?
Yeah, just pretty much the same idea, is that I know a lot of our policy is regional based, and maybe that would be something that would need to be discussed regionally as well. But there's, like I had said earlier, there's a lot of different reasons people get into gun ownership and into firearms, and we shouldn't be stopping people who are doing it in a legal and safe training way, no matter where they're living. As long as we're making sure that those safety things are being met. And maybe we might end up seeing that there needs to be different safety rules between urban and rural for storage. That's a discussion that would need to be had. But there's no reason why we should have a banning of handguns in urban areas versus rural areas. Necessarily, it's more about the safety aspect. So.
Mm-hmm.
The follow-up, we only have a couple minutes left, but the follow-up to this is, you know, framing it and defining the problems issues. So like, where are illegal guns coming from? And, you know, if there's issue of theft and the border. But there are illegal guns obtained in Canada as well, although fewer. Wouldn't these also be stolen from people who are legal gun owners? And, you know, what this is, it's great because these are the exact details I think that you get into to figure out, well, how do we stop anything like that? How do you stop people from getting illegal guns? I mean, the second it's taken from a legal gun owner, it makes it illegal. So.
Well, I think when it comes, I mean, compliance is a big part of this. Firearm owners, and they generally are very responsible. As long as they're following the basic guidelines of having the proper storage, generally we don't notice as a big issue. But it does happen from time to time, and a lot of that is very oriented around restricted weapons themselves. That's just the nature of it. But as far as finding a solution to that, that's a tough one because most people follow the rules and most people put them in safes and most people make sure that those safes are really secure and it's in certain parts of the houses. But we're always going to have people that do that to some extent. So addressing those systemic causes for criminal activity really does remain as the best option for addressing criminal activity. I mean, we want to make sure that people have their material needs met, and if people have their materials needs met, they will be less likely to steal firearms, legal or illegal. That's just put blankly. So we need to direct our efforts not against legal firearm owners who are very compliant, very responsible, and take all the precautions, and target, for lack of a better term, well, you know what? We need to target things like poverty and the lack of mental health resources and make sure that there's good jobs and safe housing for all Canadians. And when Canadians have that, they are going to be less likely to commit criminal activity. Point blank. That's just, and that's what we want to do. And the Green Party, very gratefully, has really pioneered that as far as addressing those issues are concerned. But this is something that we need to pull off a bit from firearm owners. And
yeah, and I think there's the impact thing too. I just really want to add to that.
Yeah.
In that you want to address the biggest problems. And so for this, it's illegal guns that are actually brought across the border or smuggled in versus, you know, yes, there may be these issues here, but if you can, you know, it's the same for every single policy. You have to go for impact. What's the biggest thing I can do to combat poverty, to actually address crime? What's the biggest thing I can do to deal with illegal guns? What's the biggest thing I can do to reduce emissions? Same thing, right? Because that immediate step that is going to be the easiest one that gets you the most will then allow you to see more details and reframe conversation to the next nuanced level. But if you can deal with some of the biggest problems also have some of the simpler approaches because they're so clear. Sorry, Chance, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just coming to the end. So that's all I have to add for that particular issue.
Yeah, I think you both covered it, so I don't really have anything different to add.
Well, we have 3 minutes left, so we get time for anything else, but I think I'll just close now to say thank you everybody for coming. And if Chance and Stephanie, you want to say anything else, let me know. But otherwise, thank you everybody for coming and for having this discussion. It's, you know, it is clearly a complex issue. And so we keep in mind that the answers are not going to come from one policy team or a couple people. These are real discussions we need to have. And the fact that they are not had and not had respectfully is probably the bigger problem to having any sort of progress. So we hope that that is what comes out of this. Of course, the Green Party is in a leadership race right now. So, you know, I have to do the call out to say, if anyone's interested, you're welcome to join the team, because we're having a lot of fun and we have to do a lot of work in the next month.
That's right.
And then you also get to work with Chance and Stephanie and Anthony, and they're all amazing. So, and a couple others here that are here tonight that are amazing team members that are doing tough work. So thank you all for joining this conversation, and hopefully talk to you again soon, and have a great evening, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks.